In this video, we look at understanding project management methodologies. When we say a project management methodology, what do we mean? A methodology is basically an approach towards the work, because for every project work, you would need a particular approach in order to undertake it. We may as well say that the methodology is the skeletal framework by which the work is pursued, which means that selecting the right methodology for a project is fundamental to the success of the project. Now, when we talk of a project management methodology, we make reference to a number of things. It begins with the project life cycle, and then there is also the development approach, okay, and then there is the framework, okay. So the project life cycle, which looks at the stages every project goes through, and then the development approach commands a philosophy for doing things, a way for doing things, the procedures by which certain projects are carried out. And when we talk about frameworks, frameworks are cooked up models, okay, that leverage on specific philosophies or specific procedures for doing things, so that if your organization identifies with that particular framework, then it means that all the hard work has been done. You can just adopt that framework and implement it for your project. So like I said, it begins with the project life cycle, highlighting the various stages a project goes through from the very first moment the idea is conceived to the final moment the deliverables are created and handed over. And then the development approach discusses philosophy for doing things, procedures for doing things, an approach, okay, by which things are carried out. And then the framework is a cooked up model, okay. So for instance, we have the Kanban framework, which is an agile framework. We have the Scrum framework, which is also an agile framework. But these are already prepared frameworks that command their own philosophies and their own ways of doing things, such that if you think that per the way your organization is structured and the kind of solutions you pursue, the Kanban approach or the Scrum framework, and there are several frameworks, if any of them proves useful or closest to the way you work, then you can adopt them. So in this lesson, we are going to study more deeply into these project management methodologies. We begin with what we call the project life cycle. When we say the project life cycle, I think that some people may get confused, because when we talk about projects, we are talking about endeavors that are initiated and concluded with an objective. So if every project has an end, why the cycle? Now, similarly, we can even talk about the human life cycle, because we keep making reference to the biological life cycle of humans, okay? But the question also holds true. If we are born and we ultimately die, why the cycle? Now, we call it a human life cycle because the offsprings we bear end up repeating the same stages we go through. So the human or the biological life cycle is marked by several stages. We are first born as babies, okay? That is a peculiar stage in the life of humanity. We are first born as babies. We toddle up into adolescent, young adult, we grow old, we become aged, and then we sign out. So these are specific stages in a man's life, and we go through these stages and then we conclude our existence on earth. But the offsprings we bear take over and they end up repeating these same stages. Now let's come to the environment of project management. Projects are first initiated, okay, and that is the very first moment of a project life, where the idea is initially conceived and key interface points are developed. It is the initiation stage that we go through the ideation process in order to summarize the idea of the project in order to bring it to clarity, to make sense, and connect the idea of the project to business value, to project objectives, into something concrete that makes sense to key stakeholders on the project. Now, after the initiation stage, we move to the next stage called planning. And it is in planning that we come out with estimates. Okay, in planning we create layout according to how the project is to be implemented. And once planning is done, we find ourselves in the next stage called execution. And in execution, that is when we put our plans into action in order to create the project deliverables. And once we are done with that, we move to the closure stage, where we bring our project to finality, to an official closure, and hand over the deliverables to the key stakeholders on the project. Now, when you look at the diagram, the closure stage is getting back into initiation, all right? And it is not into initiation, especially for waterfall projects, for the very project in question, but it fits into the initiation stage of subsequent projects. So for example, if you pick iPhone 13, iPhone 13 is a product that came out of a project, okay? And once iPhone 13's project is done, apart from the deliverable, which is the phone itself, several other deliverables like the experiences, okay, the lessons learned that are gathered throughout the project will be fed into the initiation stage of a subsequent project, maybe iPhone 14. So if iPhone 14 is beginning, they will pick lessons, they will connect to the previous project via the lessons learned, via the experiences, and then also repeat the same stages again. For iterative projects, even a single project may end up repeating the same cycle several times on a single project, but to those details would come to very, very soon. Now, so when we talk about the project life cycle, this is what we are making reference to. The various stages a project goes through from start to finish, okay? You see the element of monitoring and controlling in the middle, showing that these elements of monitoring and controlling is engaged at every stage of a project life. The next thing we look at has to do with the various project management methodologies we can have on our projects. Okay, so you know exactly what to do the moment you begin a project, because selecting a methodology is usually one of the first things uh, that is done on a project. Now, oftentimes you hear that if you are pursuing a project, you either choose a waterfall model or an agile model, or sometimes you do a blend of the two in what we call a hybrid model. But what exactly is waterfall and what is agile? We'll come to that. Now, waterfall is a primary life cycle, okay? Agile is a combination of two life cycles I'll be introducing to you very soon, okay? So when we get there, I'll talk to you about that, because Agile in itself is a hybrid of two life cycles that I would show you. But let's talk about waterfall first. Now, the waterfall model is also called the traditional project management, because it is what has been practiced for many, many years. Now, the waterfall model is a model that mimics the generic project life cycle, in that a project is first conceived on the ideation or the initial stages. It goes through planning, gets to execution, gets to closure, and then the project is done. We use waterfall for projects that have been done over and over and over again in such a way that we have existing blueprints to always follow. Okay, so if the project has been done over and over and over again, usually there is a blueprint, there is a defined process that you can always follow each time you intend to achieve that endeavor. Because of that, we call it the predictive life cycle, because it occurs in a predictive environment. The things that are done in that environment have been done over and over and over again. So we know our way around things. That is when you use the waterfall model. I'm going to give you some more details concerning waterfall in subsequent videos. But on this level, just understand that the waterfall is used in a predictive environment when what you are doing has been done over and over and over again. And for such reason, it's easy to use the generic life cycle to follow through the project. You just go through the initiation stage, you come to the planning stage, you get to the execution stage, and then you come to the closure stage, and everything you are done. You hand over, you go your way. Okay, that is the waterfall model. But let's look at the agile model. But I first need to introduce to you the two life cycles that merge to form the agile methodology or the agile development approach. Yeah, so like I said, the agile methodology in itself is a combination of two life cycles. So if you want to explain what the agile methodology is about, then you have to combine the explanation you give to each of these life cycles that produce the agile methodology. Now, the life cycles, we have the iterative life cycle, and then we have the incremental life cycle. So let's first look at the iterative life cycle. Now, we use the iterative life cycle when what you are doing has never been done before. When you are confronting a situation that has never been attempted before, or you are trying to do something in a way that has never been tried before. Now, because it is novel in nature, because it's never been done before, or it's never been tried before, you don't have a blueprint to follow. You see, with waterfall, there is an existing blueprint. You can follow through those procedures and get to the final outcome simply because that has been done over and over and over again. But if you are doing something that has never been done before, then you are going to employ an empirical procedure in order to get to the final outcome. Now, when we talk about empirical procedures, we are looking at a procedure that employs trial and experimentations in order to get to its final outcome. So when we talk about the iterative life cycle, it is a kind of life cycle that utilizes a lot of trials and experimentations in order to get it right. And of course, when you are going to use trial and experimentations to develop things, chances are high that you may not get it perfect during the first time. So what iterative life cycle does is that it goes through the various stages we have already highlighted and produces a first prototype or comes out with a first product or model, okay? And then we measure the degree of acceptance with that prototype. If it's not good enough, then we can look at the lessons learned, the feedback we are generating from that prototype, and feed it into the initiation stage. And then we do one more trial. So we go through the initiation, planning, execution, closure again. This time around with the benefit of lessons learned. This time around with the benefit of feedback generated from that first generation prototype. Okay, and then we develop a second prototype, which obviously will be an improvement on the first prototype. And if it's still not good enough, we go through the process once again with the benefit of newly acquired insight. Now, let's look at this situation, COVID-19, a pandemic that confronted the world all over. And then when it happened, you realize that lots of projects were authorized in order to come out with a vaccine or a cure to address the situation. Now, because that is something that has never been done before, the world has not been struck with COVID-19 before, it utilizes an iterative life cycle in order to improve on prototypes, okay? So the first effort will go through the stages, and come out with the first product, okay, or the first prototype. And for those of you who were following the story, I think that almost everyone was following the story. You could hear that they have developed something, okay, and they were testing it on creatures, on cockroaches, on lizards, on mice, and all of that, so that they would know the extent to which it can prove useful to humanity. So they would pick some lessons based on the behavior or based on the outcome of that testing. Okay, so once they've learned a lot from that outcome, they would now feed that lessons learned and feedback into the process all over again. Okay, so they go through the initiation stage, the planning stage, the execution stage, and then the closure stage. This time around with the objective of improving on the first prototype, and then they will generate the second one, and then they will test it. If they like what they are seeing, they keep moving to the next level of testing. So for those of you who are following, you realize that at a stage they even started testing on monkeys. You see that they were getting closer to humanity, okay, and they kept testing and improving upon it, prototype by prototype. It is called the iterative life cycle. So it keeps repeating the stages, okay, until they get it right. So that is what we say about iterative life cycle. You keep repeating until you get it right. Once you get it right, you know that you are done with the project. Now let's look at this other life cycle called the incremental life cycle. Now the philosophy of the incremental life cycle is very simple. Instead of creating the deliverable at the end of the project, we don't have the luxury of time to wait for that length of time. You know that for waterfall projects, typically the deliverable is created at the end of the project. So if a project is commissioned and the project will take like 2 years to complete, it means that the key stakeholders or the business or the client will have to wait for the entire length of 2 years before the project is completed and handed over to them. But in our current fast-paced world, most businesses, most customers don't have that kind of patience to wait for that length of time before receiving the deliverable. So what they do is that they are willing to receive a subset of the solution. They are willing to receive the deliverables by increment. So the incremental life cycle is a kind of development approach that creates the deliverables by installment. It creates the deliverables by increments. Okay. So every moment the customer receives a subset of the deliverable, it keeps incrementing until the final moment when the last increment is produced. So that is the incremental life cycle. So now we are going to merge the iterative life cycle and the incremental life cycle, and then we will now have the agile methodology. Now we have the agile methodology. Now, when we talk about the agile methodology, we are confronted with a situation that is novel in nature, a situation that has never been done before, or calls for empirical procedures, a lot of trial and experimentations in order to get to the outcomes. But we are also not willing to wait the entire period only to receive deliverables at the end of the project. So we want the project to be broken down into components, and then the trial and experimentations will happen component by component. As soon as we get the results we need for one component, that component is released to the client. That component is released to the business, and then we engage the next component. So that is how the team approaches the work in Agile. They engage the work component by component. And as soon as they are done with all the trial and experimentations, getting early feedback, improving on the product or on the feature increment, they release that increment to the client, and then they engage the next component, perform all the necessary trials and experimentations, get it right, and then release that. And then move on to the next component, engage all the trials and experimentations, go through it, maybe one iteration, two iterations, whatever, get it right, and release it to the client, and then engage the next component. So you could see that Agile as a methodology is a combination of the iterative life cycle and the incremental life cycle. Now, there are also situations that would call for the waterfall model and the agile model to be combined in what we call the hybrid models. Let me give you an example. Now, when you pick the automobile industry, you realize that most of the firms are testing self-driving cars, cars that do not use human drivers, cars that are that move via artificial intelligence, because it is now possible. The technology to make that possible has been perfected, so that idea can actually be conceived. Okay. Now, when you look at such a phenomenon, when you look at such a project, you would agree with me that the portion that utilizes the artificial intelligence to be able to identify a parking space by itself and park well, to be able to distinguish amongst the various lights on a traffic light and stop when they have to stop and move when they have to move. It's artificial intelligence. It's a novel thing, and then it might go through a lot of trial and experimentations. You get it? It's likely to go through that in order to perfect the system. Okay, so that portion we could say would call for an agile methodology in order to develop it. But when we pick vehicles, okay, there are some portions of the vehicle that have been done over and over again, and they don't require any trial and experimentation. We can just follow blueprints in order to develop them. For example, the windscreen of the car would not require that. The tires, the chassis, there are certain things that will not require trial and experimentations because there exist blueprints for those ones. So for such a project, it will call for a hybrid model in order to develop its deliverable. Remember, we are still training for your PMP project management certification. Join us for in-person classes in Ghana. Wherever you are in the world, in Africa, Europe, America, you can also join our online sessions. Remember, we have a very strong and effective post-training system to get you to the finish line. Also get in touch if you want to pursue the Professional Scrum Master certification, the Certified Scrum Master, or the Agile Certified Practitioner. Together, we will write that victory song. Thank you very much, and see you in the next lesson.